Give them a penny because it was tied in to making sure Windsor and keep Brampton going. And we haven't given them a penny for Brampton yet. We gave them about 55 million out of the couple billion that the feds and I and the companies agreed.
What is unfolding in Ontario is not a routine labor dispute or a temporary corporate reshuffle. It is a signal that the North American economic order is entering a far more unstable phase, where jobs can vanish, investment can reverse, and long-standing allies can no longer rely on each other's promises. When Ontario Premier Doug Ford declared that his government would give Stellantis not a penny, the statement carried far more weight than a political rebuke. It marked a breaking point in how Canada responds to companies that move production to the United States while still expecting public money from Canadian taxpayers. At the center of the controversy is a stark imbalance. Stellantis is directing approximately 13 billion United States dollars into American operations, even as production linked to Canadian plants is paused, delayed, or quietly shifted across the border. Ontario, which has released only about 55 million Canadian dollars from a multi-billion-dollar incentive framework, is now facing the reality that public funds may no longer guarantee public jobs. For decades, Canada and the United States built an auto industry on the assumption that trade rules would endure longer than election cycles. That assumption is now under strain from tariffs, political volatility, and an intensifying trade war that is reshaping corporate decisions in real time. What happens next does not stop with one factory or one province. Buried beneath this dispute is a far more serious risk, one that could alter how investment, employment, and economic security function across North America, and it will become clear only as this story unfolds to its final implications. What makes this moment more severe is not the movement of a single production line, but the ripple effect now spreading across boardrooms, labor markets, and capital planning on both sides of the border. In recent months, North American automakers have quietly slowed long-term investment approvals, signaling growing concern that policy risk is overtaking market logic. Internal industry data shows that cross-border auto supply chains rely on components that cross the Canada-United States border multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. When tariffs are introduced or even threatened, those repeated crossings compound costs rapidly. Analysts estimate that a sustained tariff regime can raise the final price of a mass-market vehicle by several thousand United States dollars, a burden that ultimately falls on consumers already under pressure from higher living costs. Employment data adds another layer of urgency. Manufacturing job growth in the United States has softened over the past year, while capital expenditures tied to long-horizon projects have become more cautious. Companies are no longer planning for decades ahead. They are planning election cycle to election cycle. That shift alone represents a structural change in how industrial economies function. And here is the most unsettling part. What is happening now may only be the early stage of a much broader economic recalibration, one that could expose a vulnerability few policymakers are willing to discuss openly, and it comes into focus only at the very end of this story. The most immediate damage from this shift is not measured in quarterly earnings reports, but in household balance sheets and community stability. When production is paused or redirected, uncertainty reaches far beyond the factory floor. Workers delay major purchases, families reconsider housing decisions, and local businesses brace for reduced spending long before layoffs ever appear in official statistics. In manufacturing-dependent regions, a single auto plant supports thousands of indirect jobs. Parts suppliers, logistics firms, maintenance contractors, restaurants, and retail outlets all rely on predictable production schedules. Even a temporary disruption can weaken these ecosystems. Economists tracking industrial regions in both Canada and the United States note that every one auto manufacturing job supports several additional jobs in the surrounding economy. When investment confidence erodes, that multiplier effect works in reverse. Income insecurity also feeds directly into broader economic stress. Workers facing uncertain shifts or transfers often rely more heavily on credit while postponing retirement contributions and healthcare spending. Over time, This reduces consumer resilience. At a national level, these individual decisions aggregate into softer consumer demand, slower growth, and increased pressure on social safety nets. There is also a psychological cost that rarely appears in trade discussions. When workers see commitments reversed despite public subsidies, trust in institutions weakens. That erosion matters. A labor force that doubts the durability of industrial policy becomes more cautious, less mobile, and more resistant to retraining initiatives that governments rely on during economic transitions. And this is only the domestic side of the equation. The cross-border nature of the auto industry means that shocks felt in Canadian communities are closely mirrored in American ones, even if the timing differs. While job uncertainty unfolds quietly, the impact on consumers tends to arrive later and more visibly. Tariffs introduced during a trade war do not stop at the border. They flow through supply chains, pricing models, and eventually into showrooms and household budgets. Modern vehicles assembled in the United States depend heavily on parts sourced from Canada. Engines, transmissions, electronic systems, and specialized metals often cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Each crossing under a tariff regime compounds costs. Industry analysts estimate that even moderate tariff levels can add thousands of United States dollars to the price of a typical vehicle, raising monthly payments for buyers already contending with elevated interest rates and insurance costs. Higher vehicle prices do not affect all consumers equally. Middle-income households, particularly those in suburban and rural areas where public transportation is limited, are hit hardest. As prices rise, demand softens. When demand softens, production slows. And when production slows, the employment risks discussed earlier intensify. This feedback loop is one of the most dangerous side effects of a prolonged trade war. There is also a strategic consequence for the United States. As costs rise domestically, global competitors not entangled in North American tariff disputes gain an advantage. Over time, this can weaken export competitiveness and reduce the global market share of manufacturers operating within the United States, even if production initially shifts inward. What makes this moment especially concerning is that these pressures build gradually, prices rise incrementally, investment decisions are delayed quietly, job losses appear scattered rather than sudden. By the time the full impact becomes visible, reversing course becomes far more difficult. And this leads to a question that policymakers have yet to answer convincingly. If the economic strain is already spreading at this early stage, what happens when the next policy shock arrives, one that forces companies, workers, and consumers to confront a far larger and more disruptive adjustment still ahead? From Washington's perspective, the situation unfolding between Ontario and Stellantis exposes a deeper strategic dilemma for the United States. The goal of using tariffs and trade pressure was to encourage domestic investment, secure jobs, and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. In the short term, some production has indeed shifted inward, but the longer-term signals are far less reassuring. Large-scale manufacturers do not evaluate countries the way politicians do. They assess risk, predictability, and the durability of rules. Over the past several years, trade policy in the United States has become closely tied to election cycles, executive authority, and sudden policy reversals. That volatility is now being priced into investment decisions. When executives cannot confidently model costs 10 or 20 years ahead, capital does not disappear immediately. It slows, fragments, and seeks flexibility instead of scale. Data from recent investment surveys shows that multinational firms increasingly rank policy uncertainty alongside labor shortages and financing costs as a top risk factor in North America. This matters because the modern auto industry requires long planning horizons. Assembly plants, battery facilities, and supplier networks are not easily relocated once built. When uncertainty rises, companies hedge by delaying commitments or spreading investment across multiple jurisdictions, even if that reduces efficiency. For American workers, the danger is subtle but real. Manufacturing employment may appear stable in the short run, but slower capital formation today translates into fewer jobs tomorrow. When allies such as Canada begin questioning whether agreements will be honored consistently, it sends a signal to other partners as well. The concern is no longer limited to one trade dispute. It is about whether the United States is still viewed as a reliably predictable anchor in global industrial planning. And once that perception shifts, restoring it becomes far more difficult than disrupting it in the first place. Internationally, the response to this moment is cautious but unmistakable. Canada's reaction is not outright confrontation, but recalibration. Officials emphasize diversification, domestic resilience, and reduced exposure to sudden policy shocks originating from the United States. This is not disengagement. It is insurance. Other allied economies are watching closely. In Europe and parts of Asia, policymakers are drawing lessons from North America's experience. They see that even deeply integrated partners can become entangled in tariff disputes with little warning. As a result, governments are accelerating efforts to localize critical supply chains, secure strategic materials, and reduce dependence on any single market, including the United States. For global competitors, the situation presents opportunity. When North American supply chains face friction, producers operating outside the tariff environment gain relative advantage. Over time, this can shift market share in sectors where the United States has traditionally been strong. The risk is not an immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Lost contracts, delayed projects, and incremental declines in export competitiveness accumulate quietly. This is how trade wars tend to evolve. They rarely end with dramatic announcements. Instead, they widen through secondary effects. Investment flows change direction, partnerships become conditional. Trust becomes transactional rather than assumed. Each individual decision may appear rational in isolation, but collectively they reshape the economic landscape. The most concerning signal is that these adjustments are now being made by allies, not adversaries. When countries that share security ties and decades of economic integration begin to hedge against each other, it suggests the trade war has entered a more advanced and unstable phase. And this raises a final, unresolved issue. If Canada is already repositioning its economy to withstand future shocks from the United States, what happens when the next escalation arrives? One that forces Washington to choose between doubling down on tariffs or confronting the long-term consequences of an increasingly fragmented global trade system. Behind the public dispute with Stellantis, Canada is quietly adjusting its long-term economic strategy to account for a future in which trade friction is no longer an exception, but a baseline condition. Policymakers in Ottawa and provincial capitals increasingly assume that the trade war environment will persist regardless of which administration is in power in the United States. This shift is visible in how Canada prioritizes investment. Instead of concentrating incentives narrowly on individual corporations, governments are directing capital toward infrastructure, critical minerals, and energy systems that reduce exposure to tariffs and political volatility. Transportation corridors, rail capacity, ports, and domestic processing facilities are now framed as economic defenses rather than growth luxuries. Critical minerals sit at the center of this approach. Canada holds significant reserves of nickel, lithium, and cobalt, all essential for electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, and defense technologies. By strengthening domestic extraction and refining capacity, Canada aims to anchor value chains at home before they can be disrupted by trade war escalation. This is not about shutting out the United States. It is about ensuring that access to these inputs cannot be leveraged unpredictably through tariffs. Energy policy follows the same logic. Nuclear generation and small modular reactors offer stable, long-horizon output that supports industrial competitiveness. Several American states have expressed interest in Canadian energy expertise and supply. That interest creates leverage, but Canadian officials are increasingly clear that cooperation depends on predictable trade behavior. The underlying message is measured but firm. Canada remains committed to partnership with the United States, but it is no longer structuring its economy around the assumption that trade rules will remain stable by default. The most consequential risk in this trade war is not immediate job losses or short-term price increases. It is the gradual normalization of hedging against the United States by its closest allies. Once that behavior becomes routine, reversing it is extraordinarily difficult. From Washington's vantage point, the shift of production back into the United States can appear like a win. Plants move south, investment announcements generate headlines. But beneath the surface, a more troubling dynamic takes hold. When Canada and other partners diversify markets, redesign supply chains, and reduce dependency, the United States loses influence quietly rather than dramatically. This matters because economic power in the modern era is less about where final assembly occurs and more about who controls upstream resources, logistics, and standards. If Canada succeeds in building resilient mineral, energy, and infrastructure networks that function independently of tariff politics, it strengthens its bargaining position over time. The United States, meanwhile, may find that its leverage diminishes even as production appears to grow domestically. The twist is this. Trade wars are often sold as tools to force better deals. But when allies adapt instead of comply, the initiator bears the long-term cost. Investment becomes cautious. Partnerships become conditional. Trust, once lost, does not return automatically when tariffs are lifted. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the full consequences will not appear in a single economic report. They will emerge slowly through missed opportunities, redirected capital, and strategic distance between economies that once operated as one. And that leaves a final, unavoidable question hanging over this entire dispute. If Canada is already preparing for a future where reliance on the United States is a risk rather than a strength, what happens to American economic leadership when the next trade war shock forces even more allies to make the same calculation? What began as a dispute over one automaker has now revealed something far more consequential. The confrontation between Ontario and Stellantis is not an isolated policy disagreement. It is a case study in how prolonged trade war dynamics, persistent tariffs, and political unpredictability are reshaping economic behavior across North America. For the United States, the lesson is uncomfortable. Tariffs can redirect production in the short term, but they also introduce uncertainty that discourages long-horizon investment. When capital becomes cautious, job creation slows quietly. When allies begin hedging instead of aligning, influence erodes gradually rather than collapsing all at once. These effects do not dominate headlines, but they compound year after year. For Canada, the response is pragmatic rather than ideological. Ottawa and the provinces are not abandoning the United States. They are preparing for a world in which reliability must be engineered, not assumed. Infrastructure spending, control over critical minerals, and energy independence are no longer optional policy goals. They are strategic safeguards against future shocks in an increasingly unstable trade environment. The deeper risk for Washington is not that Canada resists pressure today. It is that Canada adapts successfully tomorrow. Once supply chains are diversified, markets are expanded, and dependence is reduced, leverage does not easily return. Even if tariffs are rolled back, the behavioral shift remains. This is how economic leadership is tested in the modern era. Not through rhetoric, but through consistency. Not through pressure, but through trust. The trade war has already changed how companies plan, how governments hedge, and how workers perceive security. What comes next will determine whether those changes harden into a new normal. And that leaves one final question for American policymakers, investors, and voters alike. Is the current trade strategy strengthening the long-term position of the United States, or is it quietly accelerating a realignment that will only become visible when it is too late to reverse? Subscribe for more fact-based global trade analysis.